for greater safety. Do not translate this message. Not translate.
Hello, my name is Michael Flores, and welcome to my video essay, Facing the Facts, Pontypool as Representation that Society Does Not Believe What It Does Not See. Now, as a brief off-time roadmap, I will begin my essay with an analysis of Bruce McDonald's Pontypool and how it relates to my thesis, followed by a self-reflection on the journey I went on throughout this project and how my thoughts on the matter have changed from beginning to end. Now, without further ado, let me show you my thesis. I will be putting it on screen for you to read, but I will also be reading it out as I begin to explain it. While Bruce McDonald's Pontypool depicts an inexplicable illness worthy of a Lovecraft story, I believe it can be better analyzed as an example of human nature disregarding what it cannot comprehend, which leads to survivors of supernatural or unexplainable events being ultimately ignored, a phenomenon that Lovecraft observes and speaks on heavily throughout his works. First off, when I say better analyzed, I am referring to the ambiguous nature of both human nature as a concept and Pontypool as a film. Both could be interpreted in a plethora of different ways, and this is just one that I found interesting and worth looking into. Now, survivors in horror stories are not always ignored, but those cases serve as exceptions to an unspoken rule. I believe that I have identified two of the main reasons why the claims made by survivors are usually dismissed by society. These reasons are 1. Ignored due to incomprehension, and 2. Ignored due to stigma. The incomprehension reason is usually attributed to the bizarre nature of the horror element. You would have a difficult time believing that one of your friends got murdered, but you would have an even harder time believing that they were killed by a disease that only infects the English language, or by something that Lovecraft would refer to as an elder god. In contrast, the stigma reason is usually attributed to the person making the claim, who usually has a not-so-great reputation in society before making the claim in the first place. Interestingly enough, Pontypool exhibits both of these reasons in its characters. Grant himself goes from literally seeing an infected individual firsthand to calling the rest of his coworkers crazy for trying to warn him from leaving the studio, to finally being called crazy himself by the Canadian government when he attempts to warn them. For the purpose of this analysis, I will be referencing more of the incomprehensible reasons seen in Pontypool. Even if the illness surrounding Pontypool was not completely unnameable, would the authority figures that Grant and Sydney attempt to contact be of any help? Heather Drain, in her blog, Why Won't They Listen? The Horror of Being Ignored, seems to not think so. She writes that authority figures are often rendered neutered in horror and science fiction when it comes to anyone being genuinely preyed upon, and this certainly seems to be the case in Pontypool. I would argue that this ineffectiveness stems from the natural skepticism that humanity harbors towards the supernatural. Look at this clip of Pontypool, for example, where Grant ultimately disregards one of the film's ways of foreshadowing the conflict to come.
Memories are forever, and so are Kawartha Lake's granite monuments. Cast your memories in stone with Kawartha Lake monuments.
This initial interest, followed by a blatant disregard for what was just seen, is something mimicked by the Canadian government later in the film. Now, arguments could be made on behalf of characters who learned too late about the reality of the illness due to the lack of obvious symptoms. Muttering to yourself and seeming to be lost in thought is weird behavior, but certainly nothing out of the ordinary. Solveig Ottman, in their paper Broadcasting Death, Radio, Media History, and Zombies in Bruce McDonald's Pontypool, focuses on sound as one of the reasons for the illness's incomprehension. While this theory has merit, keep in mind that the Canadian government had numerous eyewitness reports to confirm the truth of the illness, yet instead chose to silence those who believed it could be cured via violence. This next clip shows the military giving a countdown before firebombing the town of Pontypool in order to purge its inhabitants and those infected. Unfortunately, I do not have the captions to show what is being said in French, though I believe it can be inferred from the context I have just provided. With this violent approach in mind, I do not believe it can be stated that survivors are simply ignored in cases dealing with the supernatural. Indeed, I believe it can be said that society would rather silence those claiming things that are difficult to comprehend before even thinking about listening to them. As Lovecraft wrote, we live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of the infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. And I believe that some parts of society would go to extreme length to prevent individuals from journeying beyond what mankind is comfortable with. Research I found in creating this project shows that some scholars agree with this point. Ethan Stoneman and Joseph Packer, in their publication of Supernatural Horror as Pessimistic Argument, share the belief that horror is simply the realization that, at a basic level, not all in the world is good. Roger Solomon, in his book Mazes of the Serpent, also ultimately describes horror as a representation of the evil nature of mankind. So, with no cavalry incoming, and under the authority of a society that would rather kill you than hear you out, what is the survivor of a horror event to do after having their warnings ignored? I believe this can diverge into two trains of thought, which I have named 1. The rise of the survivors, or 2. The collapse of society. The rise of the survivors sees horror survivors deciding that they are on their own and ultimately grow stronger because of it. We see this in a myriad of horror film protagonists, usually in strong heroines that go on to become badasses in later sequels. Now, in stark contrast, the collapse of society will see that, after being ignored or outright silenced, the warnings that the survivors cried out prove to be true, and society must either struggle with their lack of prep time in responding to the threat, or be outright destroyed. This is the route that is taken in Pontypool, where we see in the credits that the illness has not been contained and has now even made its way to the United Kingdom. With this conclusion in mind, I believe we can move into the self-reflection portion of my video essay. To crystallize the arguments made in my analysis, I believe that it is in human nature to ignore and even silence the survivors of horror events. I believe Bruce McDonald's Pontypool does a great job of representing this, and I believe there are implications that can be made regarding horror as a genre in both film and literature as to why survivors of horrific events are silenced or dismissed. This will now begin the self-reflection portion of my video essay. This portion will be a bit of a change in form from the analysis portion, as I believe it would be best to do this section in one take, as opposed to splicing different takes together, which was done in my analysis. My goal for this essay was simple. I wanted to see if there had been any research done into why horror survivors are not listened to in horror movies. Obviously, I understand there is a metaphysical aspect to it. If everyone listened to the person at the end of the movie warning people not to play with this cursed doll, filmmakers would not be able to pump out a dozen following sequels, which is a facet of the horror film industry and, to an extent, the greater film industry at large, that has simply become standard. Beyond just the desire to make more movies, I wanted to see if scholars had theorized any reason as to why horror story societies usually outright ignored warnings of the supernatural. At the same time, I wanted to find a film I could relate to this goal that was outside the normal scope of what was covered in class. Pontypool ended up being the perfect intersection of art house small budget horror and lack of social awareness when it comes to horror events. Along with Pontypool meeting my film needs perfectly, it was also a film I had never heard of before starting this project, which was an extra goal I had hoped to reach. I wanted a film that I had no bias towards and one that could both align with my thesis while also standing out from other films. In choosing a film that I had never heard of before, I ran into the problem of being unable to find the film through the many streaming services my family and I had access to. I ended up having to buy the film digitally in order to view it before deciding if it would work for the goal of my essay, which only made me more thankful that when it did. I'm sure I could have made this video essay in a more cost-effective manner, as Even after I bought the film, I realized I could not take clips from it to use in this essay straight from the streaming service, and instead had to resort to finding the clips I wanted off of YouTube. While the making of this essay could definitely have been done cheaper, I'm still pleased with the result. I learned much about the way Lovecraft structures his novels through it, and even uncovered some misconceptions that people have towards Lovecraft's work. While there are certainly examples of characters in his stories going insane, there were far fewer than what I initially thought. Many of the characters only have bouts of insanity where they struggle to comprehend what they just saw, rather than going completely crazy as a result of it. In researching Pontypool, I developed a greater respect for both Lovecraft as an artist and for filmmakers who try to adapt his stories to film. I believe that my overall knowledge in the horror genre has grown as a result of this project, though I'm not sure I entirely agree with the theories proposed by the scholars I reference in my analysis. It is entirely possible that some horror story creators draw upon bad experiences in their life when crafting their stories, Lovecraft being one of the most prominent among those examples. Yet, I don't know if I would agree that the inherent evil of mankind can apply to all horror. In true Pontypool fashion, though, I'll end this reflection with a quote by late radio host Grant Mazzy.
Today's late-breaking, developing just across my desk news story is this. It's not the end of the world, folks. It's just the end of the day.